Imagine a cop drawing his gun, mocking a man's USSS badge, only to see everything flip in an instant. What happens next will leave you stunned. Watch as power, authority, and justice collide in this shocking twist. What began as a routine encounter soon spiraled into a highly charged and dangerous situation, one that revealed the tension between authority, race, and power. It all started innocently enough. A black man going about his business, minding his own affairs, when suddenly a police officer intervened. It wasn't an ordinary interaction, but a stark moment that turned into something much more intense and significant. As the officer approached, the situation escalated quickly. The man was stopped for reasons that didn't seem entirely clear at first, but the officer's tone and demeanor soon made it apparent that it was not going to be a typical exchange. The officer, without clear justification, drew his gun. The quick escalation to force left the man in a state of disbelief. A black man who had been simply minding his business, now faced with the frightening reality of a weapon pointed in his direction. The threat of violence was real, and he knew that this was more than just a matter of following protocol. In moments like these, a person's identity and background can become the center of the entire encounter. The man, aware of the racial dynamics at play, did not panic. Instead, he made a deliberate decision to present a piece of his identity that he hoped would de-escalate the situation: his USSS, United States Secret Service badge. The badge symbolized authority, power, and a deep connection to the country's most secure institutions. It was an identifier of high status, one that should have immediately communicated his legitimate position in law enforcement and government. But instead of recognizing the weight of the badge, the officer dismissed it outright. With a mocking laugh, the officer trivialized its significance, further heightening the tension in the air. The officer's response was more than just dismissive. It was a direct challenge to the man's authority, as well as a demonstration of the officer's belief in his superiority. The officer's laughter echoed, not just in disbelief, but in a taunting way that diminished the black man's power and status, almost as if his identity and the badge itself meant nothing in that moment. This dismissal was not just a personal slight. It was representative of the larger racial dynamics at play. In a society where black individuals are often subjected to systemic bias, this encounter became a microcosm of a broader issue: the constant undermining and questioning of black authority. The officer's reaction spoke volumes about the racial biases embedded within law enforcement and the ways in which authority is viewed through a racial lens. What should have been a simple verification of identity, a routine exchange of information, became an emotional and psychological battle. The man, despite holding an important position, was forced to prove his worth and credibility, even though it was clear from the badge that he was not just any ordinary person. In a sense, the badge should have spoken for him, yet it didn't. Instead, it was belittled, making the man question how far his professional identity and status could truly go in situations like this. This moment represented much more than a police interaction. It was about racial identity and the stark reality that, for many black individuals, their credentials and personal identity can be dismissed without hesitation. Even when they hold powerful official roles, their identity can be questioned simply because of the color of their skin. The black man's calm response to the officer, despite the officer's mocking behavior, demonstrated both his understanding of the gravity of the situation and his effort to maintain control. As the encounter continued, it was clear that racial biases were not just present, but were actively shaping the dynamics. The officer's ability to wield power and authority wasn't just tied to his uniform or his badge, it was also grounded in the history of how law enforcement has treated marginalized communities. The black man's effort to de-escalate the situation by showing his USSS badge was met with mockery, and this response revealed just how far institutional biases can go. Instead of receiving the respect his badge should have commanded, he was met with ridicule. This moment was also a reminder of the immense psychological toll that these kinds of interactions take on black individuals. For the man in this encounter, the frustration was not just about the officer's actions in that moment. It was about the larger system that continues to treat black people as inferior regardless of their status, accomplishments, or identity. In a country where systemic racism is deeply rooted, moments like these are not isolated incidents. They are part of an ongoing pattern of discrimination that refuses to acknowledge the full humanity and authority of Black individuals. As tensions rose and the situation became increasingly volatile, the man's decision to remain calm in the face of such racial hostility was both a testament to his resilience and a chilling reminder of the ways in which such encounters often unfold. His identity, the badge, and his professional background should have granted him respect. Instead, they were used as tools for mockery and disrespect. This was not just a confrontation between a police officer and a Black man, it was a vivid illustration of how racial bias can seep into even the most professional settings. The officer's reaction to the man's USSS badge was not just an individual mistake. It reflected the larger issue of how power is perceived through the lens of race. The implications of this encounter go far beyond the immediate exchange. They point to a deep, ingrained issue in society that continues to challenge the very idea of equality and justice for all. What began as a tense interaction rapidly grew more intense as the officer's mocking behavior escalated the situation. The Black man's attempt to de-escalate by showing his USSS badge was dismissed without hesitation. The officer's laughter wasn't just an expression of disbelief, it was a blatant signal of disregard for authority and a challenge to the man's established position. Rather than recognizing the authority of the badge, which should have been a clear indicator of the man's credentials, the officer's mocking tone only added to the growing tension. The refusal to acknowledge the badge didn't just insult the individual in front of him, it was a sign of how the officer viewed the situation through a racially biased lens. The power dynamics at play were clear. The officer's behavior suggested that, in his eyes, the man was not deserving of the respect that his status should have commanded. The badge, a symbol of authority and security, was reduced to something meaningless in the officer's eyes, further signaling the racial divide that exists within many interactions involving law enforcement. The Black man, despite being subjected to this blatant disrespect, remained calm and composed. However, it became evident that each passing moment brought more risk. His rights were continuously dismissed as irrelevant, and the officer's actions indicated that his identity, marked by his official position, held no weight in this interaction. The situation was no longer just about a man trying to assert his credentials, it was about the way race, power, and identity collided in a very real and dangerous way. As the officer's behavior grew more erratic, the Black man's situation became more precarious. It wasn't just the officer's actions that were concerning, but the larger context of racial bias that fueled his decision-making. The officer's disregard for the badge and his escalating aggression showed the deep racial tensions that often underlie such encounters. What should have been a routine exchange now risked becoming an example of unchecked power and abuse of authority. In a sudden shift, the power dynamics of the encounter took a dramatic turn. What had seemed like an unchecked display of authority, fueled by the officer's mocking attitude and aggressive posture, quickly unraveled. The officer's dismissal of the man's USSS badge and his continued attempts to assert dominance seemed to be an effort to reaffirm his control. However, the officer's actions were about to have the opposite effect, and the situation took a sharp, unexpected shift. The Black man, initially under threat and enduring the officer's aggressive behavior, found a way to regain control of the narrative. What had been a tense and threatening standoff suddenly flipped as the man was able to turn the tide in his favor. Rather than caving to the officer's disrespect, the man's resilience and calm demeanor became his greatest strength. By maintaining control of the situation and refusing to back down, he shifted the power dynamics completely. The moment marked a pivotal change. The officer, once in control, found himself on the defensive. The power he thought he wielded so effortlessly evaporated as his actions began to backfire. What had begun as a show of dominance quickly became an embarrassing and unjust display of authority. In that instant, it was no longer about the officer's position of power. Instead, it became about accountability and the consequences of abusing that power. The officer's failure to respect the man's badge or acknowledge his authority set in motion a series of events that would ultimately turn against him. What initially seemed like an abuse of power became an undeniable example of its misuse. The officer, instead of standing tall in his perceived position of authority, found himself in a vulnerable position, held accountable for his actions. What had begun as an unjust and potentially dangerous interaction turned into a defining moment of justice, a reminder that power, when unchecked, inevitably leads to its own downfall. The fallout from the encounter was swift and decisive, leaving a clear message about accountability and the consequences of abusing authority. Within moments, the officer found himself in handcuffs, the very symbol of his authority now turned against him. What had started as an attempt to assert power over another individual had quickly morphed into a situation where the officer was held accountable for his actions. This rapid reversal highlighted the fragility of unchecked power, especially when it is wielded unjustly. For the black man, this outcome was more than just a personal victory. It was a public reminder of the importance of standing up for one's rights, even in the face of overwhelming authority. The swift actions taken against the officer showed that even those in positions of power could be held accountable when they overstepped their bounds. It was a clear demonstration that no one, not even law enforcement officers, is above the law. The incident resonated beyond the immediate situation, triggering a wider conversation about systemic issues within law enforcement. It served as a stark reminder of how power dynamics often play out in encounters between law enforcement and marginalized communities. In a society where instances of abuse of power have historically gone unchallenged, this event stood as an example of what happens when accountability is demanded, regardless of one's status or position. The officer's swift downfall illustrated the importance of checks and balances within systems of authority and the need for constant vigilance to ensure that power is not misused. However, the consequences were not limited to just the officer. The event also sparked a broader public discourse on racial bias within law enforcement and the ways in which authority is often exercised disproportionately. The man's calmness in the face of such aggression and his refusal to back down became a symbol of resilience. In the aftermath, people across the community and beyond recognized the significance of this moment, seeing it as a clear example of how standing firm in the face of injustice can lead to change. In the end, the incident acted as a powerful reminder that justice is not just about the actions taken against individuals, but also about the broader systems in which they operate. The true lesson of this moment was about the strength required to hold those in power accountable and the need for a society where respect, fairness, and equality prevail for everyone. Stay informed and join the conversation on social justice with Expect Stories, where truth and accountability matter.